I speak across the country about sexual violence prevention and men's identity development. Don't tweet this because I'm not sure I have it exactly right. But James Baldwin said, "How can love help us remove the masks we know we cannot live within, but we fear we cannot live without?" And I think that's what I would want to say about masculinity, about men's identity, and how we experience it. I've been doing research on college men for 15 years, including a longitudinal study with the same men interviewed over 10 years. And raise your hand if you identify as a man or you have a man in your life. Anyone? Okay, so I want you to think about this in terms of your own self or in terms of the men in your life. And as you're thinking about this, try not to think about men in general. If you're a man, think about yourself. If you're not a man, think about the man you feel closest to, who you feel like you know the best, right? Maybe a partner, maybe a father, maybe your son, maybe a close friend. In my research, interviewing college men, I interviewed them deeply when they were in college. I interviewed them 5 years later when they were in their mid-20s, and I interviewed them 5 years later when they were in their early 30s. And I want to just give you the brief snapshots of those experiences. When I interviewed them as college men, we talked about how society expected them to think, feel, and behave, and not think, feel, and behave as men. And how society expected them to think, feel, and behave as men and not think, feel, and behave as men, according to them, was not great. It was John Belushi from the movie Animal House. Now, that movie had come out before any of them were born. But for them, they felt like that was who they needed to be. They needed to party, they needed to be into women, they needed to drink, they needed to do drugs, they needed to not care about academics. I don't mean like that guy from that movie. I mean, that was literally the visual image they had of what all of you expected them to be like as men. And then they would whisper to me somewhere along the lines of the interviews, and they would say, "But that's not me." And they all had this secret that I know those expectations are for all of us, and I know it comes naturally to all the other men who are here, but that's not me. And so sometimes I pretend to be that guy, or I fake it, or in their language, I put on that mask. And so what's interesting to me is that all 10 of the men who I interviewed, who are very different in terms of their social group identities, very different in terms of their sexual orientation and their race and their class, and very, very different in terms of how they spent their time on campus, from scholarship athlete to sexual violence prevention to pre-med to RA to Black Student Union president to all these different things. They all had the same secret, which was, I know what the world expects of me, and I know that comes naturally to everybody else, but not me. And so here's the thing I figured out. I fake it, I put on this performance, I wear this mask. And every single one of them told me the same secret. But they thought they were the only ones who were doing that. And so the secret that I know was I was the 11th participant in the study. And that's how I experienced masculinity as a college student, and still today. I know what society expects of me, I don't feel like I measure up, and so I pretend sometimes. From ridiculous, silly, super humorous examples to deep, spiritual, identity, sense of self kind of things. So when I was in 4th grade, a friend of mine who actually ended up coming to St. Olaf said, he was a 5th grader, so he had life figured out according to me as a 4th grader. He said, "What kind of music do you like?" And I thought, well, I've got to prove my manhood. I mean, what kind of music do you like? I'm in 4th grade. My dad listens to NPR. Like, I don't understand the question, right? But he said, "What kind of music do you like?" And I thought of the most manly things that I could come up with at that time. And just to show you how little I knew about music, I said things like, like Journey, Odyssey, Starship. Now, some of you know those bands. Great, that's helpful. Not very manly, I would say, but it just sounded like those names sounded awesome. And I said, "Well, what do you like?" And I thought, he's got the right answer because he's got life figured out. And he said, "Oh, Tears for Fears." And I thought, I did it wrong. I did it totally wrong. But as a 4th grade boy, I felt the need to prove my manhood to this 5th grade boy by pretending I liked music that I had no idea about. And think about how you or men in your life do that too. It led to a lot of consequences for them, for women in their life, for lots of other folks. And it also has consequences for everyone in the community, because those men's putting on the mask led them to use drugs, drink, be aggressive, swear, curse, demeaning and degrading sex to prove their manhood to other men in the locker room or the chapter house, things they didn't even want to do. And so later we'll talk a lot more about that. 5 years later, they had a very different perspective. When they were in college, they were basically figuring out, how am I not good enough, and how do I pretend to be man enough? How are the ways that I'm not man enough, and how do I put that mask on? How do I wear it? How do I do that? How do I pretend to be man enough? And wearing the mask covered up who they really were that wasn't man enough, and portrayed an image to you that you would see as man enough. So it was covering up and it was projection. 5 years later, they were really in this process of discovery. Who am I? They were dabbling, experimenting, trial and error. This is the job I have, but I don't know if this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. This is the relationship I'm in. It's pretty good, but I don't know if this is the person I want to be with for the rest of my life. I live here now. Is this where I want to live for the rest of my life? I don't know. Maybe I want to move to Seattle and see what that's like. I don't know. They were really dabbling, experimenting, trying to figure out what really is going on for me, because I don't want to pretend anymore. But I've been pretending my whole life, so I don't know who I am. I got to figure out, who am I versus what do other people want me to be. And they were doing that very actively. 10 years after they were college students, when they were early 30s, in committed relationships, they had kind of figured out who they were, and they're all connected to me in many different ways, and they understand this, and they're very invested, and they want the book to come out, and they can't wait to do more interviews. And so I would say, how are you still doing this mask-wearing things? And they would say, I don't know. It's been 10 years. I think I'm doing pretty good. I said, well, what about at work? And they would say, well, at work you got to be professional, right? There's rules. You can't curse. You can't objectify people. You can't do these things. You can't do that stuff at work. You have to be professional. And you could see they're feeling pretty good about themselves. And I said, well, what about at home? And they'd say, well, no, I mean, my wife's the strongest person I've ever met in my life, so I'm not going to pretend with her. Or I live with my mother and my sister. They've known me my whole life. Or I live with my partner, who's also a transgender man, and we've given up on that. We just take the mask off. We don't do that stuff. And you could see them sort of feel like, well, I don't do this at work and I don't do this at home. I think I've got it figured out. And then I would say, what about with your friends? And they would go, oh, no. And they would tell stories about talking about their version of masculinity at the corporate meeting with 50 of their new staff in beautiful, amazing, transparent ways. And then the very next weekend, going on the corporate golf outing and doing exactly what he had done in the fraternity house. Naked women teas, jokes about misogyny, all of these things throughout that. And he was so embarrassed. Or the man who lived with his mother and his sister and did progressive activist politics around immigration and living wage and all these things. So, I can't get away with that stuff at work, right? People will have me for lunch. I said, well, what about when you're hanging out with your friends? And he said, oh, I play soccer with these guys on Thursday night. It's bad. And then we go out for beers afterwards, and it's even worse. What am I doing? And this existential crisis of sort of like, after 10 years of having these conversations with you, I'm pretty good at work, I'm pretty good at home, but I still pretend to put on that mask to prove my manhood, to cover up and project that. And so I would just ask you to consider, what are the ways for you or the men in your life? What are the ways they maybe feel they're not good enough, not man enough? What are the ways you don't feel man enough? And how do you pretend? And how you pretend, what's the cost of that? To your authenticity, to your humanity, to the people in your life, to the communities that you're a part of? What's the impact of that? And what would you gain by taking the mask off and living your true self? Good luck with that.